Disengagement, good to have you with us in the 9 p.m. edition of the Urban Debate. On to the other big story of the day, politics over the India-China disengagement along the LAC, and many questions that have emerged about what's really happening and the disengagement that has begun. Is that a good thing for our country or not? Now, after the disengagement process actually began in Ladakh yesterday, the government came out with another set of detailed statement and clarifications today. And this is largely because there's been much speculation, many questions, and some reportage, some politics about what India may or may not have conceded, and if this disengagement is actually in our favor, or are we actually giving in to what China wants. So the Ministry of Defense came out with another statement, and they said that India has not conceded any territory as per this agreement, that posts on Pangong Tso are well established, that India has prevented the unilateral change in status quo. And of course, they also did confirm that this is just in this one part. We are still to resolve and talk about and address the issue of disengagement at Hot Springs, Gogra and Depsang areas. And this will only begin after the disengagement in this specific zone is over. The statement also ended on a very strong phrasing by saying that those doubting the achievements are disrespecting the soldiers. This isn't a statement by the army itself. This is a statement by the Ministry of Defense. Now, effectively, what has happened? We went into a deadlock around May last year when we found out that China had actually begun to enter and cross much into territory that India considers its own. There's obviously a bit of a gap in between. But we realized that China had come much beyond a point that is comfortable for us. Then there was escalation from both ends. More and more troops, more and more artillery, more and more tanks were brought in. More and more units were brought in from both sides. In some locations, it was literally face-to-face kind of a standoff that we saw. Then we saw the clash that took place in Galwan, one of the worst kind of clashes that we've actually seen in India and China's history. Now we're looking at a situation where the two sides have agreed to disengage in this finger area. Now that's the Pangong Lake. Around this lake, between the north and the south bank, you have about 8 of these points, which are these finger points, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. China has now agreed to move from finger point 4 all the way to the east of finger point 8. And India has agreed to move from around the same area to finger point 3. Now, we're given to understand that this is where we always had some kind of permanent structure. And beyond finger 3, India maintained that we had the right for patrolling all the way up to finger 8. But China, over the last many months, especially in 2020, managed to come all the way in, which is roughly about 8 kilometers, say the experts. They've now been pushed back. This is just one face-off point. Many other areas are still pending. We'll get into the details as we go along. But what has sparked off a bigger debate is a statement made by Rahul Gandhi, questioning this entire disengagement process and asking, what about the fact that in other areas you haven't mentioned about disengagement? Asking the question, in fact alleging that Prime Minister Modi is a coward and he's ceded our territory to China. And that is a fact as per Rahul Gandhi. This has now led to a political fight from both ends. So while we do look into some of the technicalities and what this disengagement process means for us, we will also look into the political fight and see if there are any merits to what the Congress party is raising here, or if the government needs to be a little clearer about what the situation is. Let's say good evening to Maroof Raza, Strategic Affairs expert and consulting editor to the Times Network, Sudesh Sharma, spokesperson for the BJP, Dr. Ajay Kumar of the Congress Party, and Lieutenant General Satish Dua joining us this evening. Thank you so much to all of you. General Dua, let me begin with you. In terms of this zone that we are looking at, where the disengagement has started. Now, the Defense Ministry says that we go back to our permanent setup at finger 3, China goes back to beyond finger 8, and there will not be any patrolling between these two zones until there is further conversation. Would one say that that is status quo to what was before April 2020?
Status quo ante, that we go back to our post, they go back to theirs. And our last post was at Dancing Tapa post, which is at finger 3. In fact, it is slightly short of finger 3. Their last post is at finger 8. The area in between finger 8 and this, our post, used to be patrolled by both sides, and that was the norm being followed, where we have differing perception of LAC. Now, let me clarify that this no patrolling that there will be no patrolling is only a temporary arrangement, as the Raksha Mantri also stated, during these days of disengagement, so that we don't get into a flashpoint kind of situation. Having said that, let me just clarify one issue. Posts and patrolling are two different things. Post is a permanent presence with group of bunkers, etc. Patrolling is when you patrol that area to go and see that area that other side has not constructed any emplacements. So that these are two different things.
And in fact, we're given to understand, General Dua, that as part of this disengagement process, whatever China would have managed to set up as structures between finger 8 and finger 3 will also be dismantled. So essentially, that would be a big pullback from their end.
Absolutely. Any structures that have been created after the last April or May have to be pulled back, and that is the status quo ante. And that is why we've said, let's not verify by patrolling. Remember, Galwan was one such verification patrol which went horribly wrong with disastrous consequences, casualties on both sides after half a century. So having said that, so we've decided, so that we don't get into a situation, let us pull back, let us reassure each other by activities, I beg your pardon, by meetings, by photographs, satellite imagery, drone photography, etc., before we get down to verification by physical patrolling.
All right. Maroof, if I can come to you as well before I go to our political representatives, because the big controversy seems to be of whether or not we've ceded anything from our end. Let's begin with this zone itself, the first phase of disengagement, which is the finger area zone, before we go to other parts. To your understanding, is there something to be concerned about?
I'm sorry, I couldn't. Is the question to me?
No, General Dua, I'll take that question to Maroof Raza if he can hear me though.
Yeah, Tanvi, General Dua, who I've known and have great regard for him because we were cadets together, is a man who is very well placed to explain this. Having last held the position of CISC, he's very up to speed with all our military border engagements, etc., for all the three services and various other aspects. But the point to understand is, I feel there are 3 or 4 points that need to be addressed. General Saab has cleared the practical aspects on the ground, which means that patrolling will have to resume to reassure ourselves that status quo would be maintained when we go back to status quo ante. Now, the issue involved is that China has done the pullback of the tanks, which is the easiest to do. The issue is that to what extent we will be able to monitor any further Chinese ingress into this area, and likewise if this arrangement happens elsewhere. To that extent, and General will bear with me on that we are still short of the kind of intelligence assessment tools that we need, like satellites and things like that, because much of that will depend on the imagery if you don't want to have direct troop-to-troop engagement, which could lead to another Galwan kind of a fist fight and the consequences thereof. The second aspect is to say that this government, and I think it was very unfair to comment that the Prime Minister has not shown the courage or used words like cowardice, etc. The central issue is that China has been very largely present right across Aksai chain, along which On the western side of Aksai Chin and the eastern part of Ladakh runs the line of actual control. And China's presence and build-up there took place from the 1950s, and it was only late in 58, plus minus, thereafter, that Pandit Nehru's government came around to accepting that, yes, Chinese presence had built up out there. What eventually led is part of history, the conflict thereafter. But even since then, there have been some attempts to try and define what should be our positions. The problem is that the entire line of actual control is not a defined line. It's a line of perceptions. It means I say this is mine and you say that is yours. And okay, let's not get into a fight. So let us agree more or less to some kind of a line. Now, that is along which the morchas have been dug up and troops are positioned on the ground. And therefore, it became de facto a kind of a acceptable boundary line. The problem lies that no political establishment, including the current government, has had the vision or the courage or the political savvy to come up and say, okay, what is it we are willing to give and what is it we are willing to take to come to some kind of an agreement, notwithstanding the fact that Chinese are past masters of smoke and mirrors. They will first offer you that let's settle the Aksai Chin on the basis of a swap, which Chow En-lai did in 59 and 60, and you keep Arunachal Pradesh and the McMahon line, and then they'll go back on it. And of course, Panditji himself said that I cannot be seen to be horse trading. These were the words he used. Then you go back now to Rajiv Gandhi's visit to Beijing. That's when another map was shown to him. And that is when the contours of the current line of actual control began to take shape until Vajpayee ji's visit in 2003. But ask yourself, between 2003 and now, we have got nowhere with the Chinese on coming to some kind of an agreement like the line of control with Pakistan is a defined boundary.
Correct.
For all practical purposes. It's not the final international boundary, but it is closest to what is a de facto boundary. Here, that is not defined, and therefore it will leave room even after this for another round of disagreements and things of that nature.
Absolutely.
And third and most important aspect is that this movement has only taken place in an isolated one part of the entire line of actual control. So don't count your chickens before they are hatched. Don't pass accusatory remarks against anybody. Wait for the whole game plan to evolve and roll out before you can come to a conclusion, and that might take a year or two, that you have actually made some gains or made some losses. Please remember that the entire territory that the Chinese occupied after 2020, post-April, was something close to plus minus 30 to 40 square kilometers. But what the Chinese are sitting on since their occupation of Aksai Chin in the 50s is more than 30,000 kilometers. So what is more? 30,000 square kilometers or 30 kilometers plus and minus? And are you willing to risk a war or a conflict just because somebody says you're not brave enough? That would have fool's courage, quite frankly. So we need as a nation, come to some kind of an agreement that what are we willing to accept without putting our own leadership and the adversary's leadership into a tight bind, which then escalates situation beyond control.
You know, I will say one thing before, Maroof, I completely agree with you that in irrespective of what the internal differences in politics are to make comments to say that the Prime Minister is a coward over an issue where you barely even have any evidence to ask questions, over an issue where your own historically, governments of your own party have actually ended up creating a bigger disaster of this entire zone than this government has, is completely unacceptable. So let me actually ask this question to Ajay Kumar then. Ajay Kumar, on what basis are we saying today that land has been ceded to the Chinese side?
No, first of all, Tanvi, the fact is that even the presence of Chinese in the Indian territory was not revealed by the government. It was by reports coming in from independent people and journalists who were telling on defense issues. Did the government come and tell you that there are infiltration attempts across the border for the past 1 year? First question. The second question is the biggest fallacy is to say that questioning the government is not good for the country. Now, who reported the Chinese infiltration? Forget everything else. And so, if the government didn't have the integrity to tell that there is an increased Chinese movement in Hot Spring, Gogra, in the finger up to finger 4, from finger 8 to finger 4, and even in Arunachal Pradesh, it's only independent people reporting. And then we say that questioning this, like Maroof correctly said, 1950 to 58, I think, and General Dua was absolutely spot on. The issue is not, the issue is, first of all, the BJP is offended that we are questioning the language and the words used. Okay, so let's set that aside and say the first question is, did the government tell you? So if the Chinese are coming in and India says, no, everything is okay, is that acceptable? Is the first question we need to ask as Indians. Because if we are going to say that Depsan Valley is, with the Chinese presence is huge there, that we are stepping down from the Kailash range, and if we are asking this question to this government, because there's no other way we can ask them. They don't allow us to debate on national issues. You don't allow us to debate even on farm issues. Forget on defense issues in China. Is there a statement? And the only time the government today replied was when Mr. Gandhi had a press conference. What was the first initial statement, Tanvi? And this misconception in this country that to question the government is wrong is the biggest fallacy. That is fascism. And that is how the Germans, even you had the same thing in World War when Germans were losing. You question German, Hitler, then it was a bad. The question is we need to question people to make India safer. And my question is, did we step back from
Dr. Ajay Kumar, my question to you was not about you wanting to ask questions. Everybody has a right to ask questions, and I am not one of those who believes asking questions makes you question the national security or put the national security at risk. I am asking you, basis what evidence are we now saying that the government has ceded territory in this zone where the disengagement is taking place? Because that was what the allegation of Rahul Gandhi is.
Yeah, so okay. So we are saying, let us go that. You're stepping back from finger A4 and finger 3 was really permanent. So that's the finger 4 and finger 8 issue is one part to it. The question is, are the Chinese still in Depsan Valley? Are they still in Hot Springs? And have we stepped down from Kailash Range, where we have certain amount of strategic advantage? I'm not an expert on military issues. I just read a little bit and get briefed on it. And so to be candid with you, those two experts would know it more. The question is, only when we question, did the government come and say this is part of the disengagement? The government didn't have the integrity to start with, even mentioning Depsan Valley and Kailash Range and Hot Spring. It's today. Today the government clarifies.
Okay, I got the point.
Is that.
So, let me take up this point. Let me take up this point and take it to Sudesh Verma. Sudesh Verma, so now let's get a clearer understanding of what the charge is. The charge is that when you spoke yesterday, you didn't give out the full details. You only spoke about disengagement and made it sound like we are back to the situation as it was in April 2020 without acknowledging these three areas and naming the other three areas where situation still is in a bit of a standoff and challenging. Today, the MOD statement mentions these three areas and says the disengagement conversation here will only begin 48 hours after this process is done. Could you not have said this earlier?
Can I respond to many other issues raised? Then I'll come to your questions also.
No, this is what the Congress is raising, but yes, go ahead. In the order you want to speak about it.
Tanvi, you must make a distinction between, when campaign was going on 2014 for Lok Sabha elections and Modi ji at a rally in Delhi, Rohini said, because Nawaz Sharif had referred to Dr. Manmohan Singh as Idiati Aurat, because he said that why he goes and complains to US President all the time. And Modi ji took up this, and how dare you talk about our Prime Minister in that language? And he took the cudgels with Nawaz Sharif, he criticized Nawaz Sharif. It's not the congressman who did that. Prime Minister belongs to everyone. But here, the way they are challenging the Prime Minister, it's kiddish. It's like a school debate. You don't have any substance left in you. And to me, I've been a student of history. I can tell you, because Rahul Gandhi's Nanaji was very scared of Chinese, and the way Chinese actually cheated him, and the entire country burned, bore the brunt of that. And the fear still continues in Mr. Rahul Gandhi, and that is why he talks like that. This is a new India. And you see, it's not Modi ji or the BJP fighting, going to borders and fighting, it's the army. And the army says that Galwan clash should be celebrated because we have martyred our soldiers and inflicted heavy casualty on the enemy. And that was the bravery of the soldier that has forced the world to recognize that what metal Indian army is made of, Tanvi. And that is the beauty, the whole world is appreciating the way India has dealt with the crisis. It was a crisis situation that one of the most powerful countries in the world at your neighbor having built up those arms, but we gave a matching built up and India was not going to buckle down. And the whole world was watching that how India is going to behave and the way disengagement process is going to happen now. People like Mr. Maroof Raza or General Dua can tell you, it's a long process. It's not that you decide and everything happens in a day. The build-up takes time. The disengagement takes time, and one must understand strategy, defense. These are very sensitive issues. Mr. Rahul Gandhi has no problem taking donations from Chinese side, has no problem meeting stealthily the ambassador of China and having a tie-up with them because he signed an agreement with Chinese side as vice president of the Congress party. He has no problems with that. But with something which is happening in public domain, it's happening in public domain. Nothing is hidden. Nobody can hide anything. Whatever the army is saying, the government is acting as per that. So many times the government's representatives have visited the borders, including the Prime Minister, the Defense Minister, other ministers. And you are speaking in that language. It is very sad. The way Mr. Rahul Gandhi has spoken, it only shows that, he's acting like a juvenile.
Okay. I want to go back to our experts, but quick reaction from Ajay Kumar, and then I have a few questions for our experts. Yes.
So it is very rich that the same government which gave the Pulwama details to one of the anchors of the TV on a WhatsApp message says that
right.
it is
not right. Don't insinuate.
Let's talk on WhatsApp message today. Let's talk on WhatsApp message on national security.
Okay, gentlemen. One at a time, please, and let's stick to what we are talking about right now. Yeah.
Who are supporting you? Shame on you on national security. What are you talking on national security? I mean, it's unfortunate when you can give it on a TV anchor and then you talk about national security. Come on, sir. That's not done, Sudesh.
Okay, I would like to say to both of you gentlemen and supporters of both of your parties that I think we should just leave the idea of nationalism and being national or anti-national or showing your patriotism to those who are in the forces. Let them do the job, please. Let's not pretend to be with them or speak on behalf of them. Let them do their job, and the government and the opposition needs to do their own job. Now, if I can just come in here and ask two questions, General Dua, to begin with you. There was much conversation also about other zones where India had also taken a stronger position. Post the Galwan clash, we also, moved in and held on to certain areas which we're given to understand China wanted us to recede from as part of this entire disengagement process. Now, we don't have any clarity from the government, but once the finger zone disengagement is done, would that be something that we'll have to look at next? The three pending zones where the conflict still continues, how do you view the process from here on?
Okay, to put things in a clear perspective, the north bank of north bank of Pegongso is the finger area. We've spoken enough about it. The south bank of Pegongso has these important heights that you were referring to, which we have occupied on 29th of August, and we are in an position of advantage over there. Then there is the Depsang Plain, which was mentioned referred to a little while ago also. Now, let me clarify that the finger area as well as south of Pegongso, the disengagement has started together. You saw the visuals of tanks moving. That is to the south of Pegongso. That the videos that we saw yesterday. But this is the initial steps of disengagement. When we say disengagement, in this entire area of Pegongso, both north and south, our troops were in a very close proximity, literally at places in eyeball to eyeball configuration. which is not healthy for armed forces to be in that kind of, it could create a flashpoint at any time. In Depsang, on the other hand, it is only an issue, I mean, I shouldn't say only, it's an issue of patrolling rights.
Yes.
There are no structures or emplacements, and that issue is a separate. It became a flashpoint. In fact, it was first discovered nearly 20 years ago, 19 to be precise, 2002. It became a point of difference between both the countries. In 2013, there was a flashpoint for there was a standoff like this for 20 or 21 days, which was then later on resolved. So coming back to the point, yes. South of Pegong So, where tanks are disengaging, where we are at height, when we say status quo ante, it will take a long time for us to really disengage to that part where we move away from each other after a step-by-step process. Meanwhile, like at the expense of reputation, we have suspended patrolling so that we don't get into some fights during these days. Eventually, we will get to patrolling. And my take is perhaps I'll answer. Maroof made a point on that maybe we can have joint patrolling to ensure that there are no flashes, there are no fisticuffs, but we actually verify things on ground. But that is let's leave it to the practitioners, army on ground. They will know what to do best and what has been agreed to between the two sides. Depsang is a separate issue, and the statement of, as I understood the statement of Defense Minister yesterday, that remaining areas will be now spoken of or in another meeting which will be held within the next 48 hours. And those meetings will be on as simultaneously as we continue to disengage from the areas that we've already agreed to. Thank you.
Yes, absolutely. And in fact, those are the things that were actually not mentioned in these many details yesterday. And so there was quite a bit of speculation. There were many, many questions that were raised, which is why I think the Ministry of Defense had to come out with this detailed statement today. But Maroof, basis what has now happened since May 2020 to now February, and will take a while for us to, hopefully normalize this situation, but many, many months. And you've been saying this since we started discussing this last May. Basis this, do we now know that things will never go back to the way they were? We will have to ensure that there is some amount of troop presence in the forward posts, and that there is a lot more of patrolling that has to be done in zones that usually were left open, with some amount of trust on the other side.
See, trust is now at a very low level between India and China. That's because all along, there were those in South Bloc that boasted that we have continued to manage our borders or boundaries with China without bullets being fired, barring aside, the Nathula standoff and Chola standoff. And then you had in 1975 a patrol that came under Chinese fire. But that apart, till Galwan, there were no deaths or casualties of any serious nature. Patrolling is, so therefore, trust, I don't believe, would go back to where it was perhaps 5 or 10 years ago, before these intrusions began, because now a lot of water, quite literally, has flown under the bridge, the Galwan bridge specifically. And we need to understand that the China of today and the India of today is very different from the India and China of today, of yesterday, of the 60s. So China has to do a reality check that they cannot teach us a lesson anymore, which has been a regular Chinese boast. But what has happened on the LAC has given them a wake-up call. But more importantly, it's given us a wake-up call, because we have had to recalibrate now what kind of troop levels we will deploy there. Classically speaking, you used to have one division covering the entire LAC stretch, or plus minus, a heavy division, say, division plus. Now, you're looking at 2 divisions plus maybe 3 divisions. These will have to be pulled out from elsewhere. So the focus on the Pakistan threat will have to decrease, and we have to seriously look and prepare for the two-front threat, which has on and off been talked about, and people are jumpy about that whenever it is mentioned. But it's best to be straight and upfront about it. And we have the capacity and the capability, and I'm sure General Dua will agree with me, to handle the sovereignty and integrity of our territory without being too offensive on a two-front threat scenario. So that is my belief, having done a fair amount of homework on that. Now, the third aspect is that patrolling apart, there are two ways to man long borders. The entire stretch of the China-India boundary, which is disputed, some say it is 3,488 kilometers, some say 4,250 kilometers. There are varying views. But the fact is, this is a huge boundary. And it is, yes, you have to have trenches everywhere. But between trenches, between posts, as General Saab brought out, you need to have foot patrols to go and verify that the area that should not have been occupied by the adversary remains as such. Where you are not able to do so, or you take their trust for granted, as happened with the Pakistanis around Kargil Heights, the same thing happens here. Somewhere down the line, you get surprised.
Right.
And then it's a long drawn out process to regain lost ground. Now, this lost ground regaining, to my mind, will not be entirely to our satisfaction. So therefore, we should not turn around and blame any one government, because in these areas, what you grab is for you to keep. And India has shown its respect for the status quo, not just with China, not just with Pakistan, but even in other neighboring countries, whether Bangladesh or Maldives.
Yes.
We respect the status quo. But the other adversary doesn't do that. Why? Because China's vision is to absorb all of Ladakh, Tibet being the palm, all of Ladakh, Nepal, Bhutan, Sikkim, Arunachal, the five fingers that come out of the palm. And no leadership in China can rest without at least attempting to fulfill that vision of Mao.
Yes.
So be prepared. You may get another big surprise again. And as a senior general was discussing with me, who has been very familiar with the Northern Command, and said to me, they may pull out here, but they'll give you another surprise somewhere else. And how long are you going to go through this crisis to crisis mode? You need to get to the maps. You need to get them to get to the maps and get a little more real about what is your boundary line.
Yeah, this is a very valid point, Maroof, that you raised earlier also, and I want to take that point across to Sudesh Verma, that the biggest problem is, and it will go on for years and decades together, Sudesh Verma, until we, really find the commitment and the will to resolve it, which is the line of actual control and the disagreements. For us, even in this zone, if we take it as an example, the line of actual control is around finger 8. For China, they can claim what they want and say, no, it's around finger 4. We have the right to come all the way up till there. And in many parts in Ladakh and in Arunachal and along the border, clashes will continue to happen. When is the government going to pick up this issue and try and resolve it once and for all?
You can trust, Tanvi, that there is a very mature leadership, and you can trust that they will do something to find a solution to this issue, which has been hanging for such a long time. You know that trustworthy economic relations not possible unless you resolve the conflicting issues, because our history with China is not very, very good. And ask any Indian, not to talk of the government, they will say that they don't trust China. And the way it has panned out, it is not in the best interests of both India and China. And you see, but diplomacy is conducted, behind the curtain. You don't saber rattle. You don't, shout from the rooftop when you are going to disengage or you're going to get into some negotiation. But the determination is shown on the borders, and that is shown by the army. The way Indian Army has captured some of the heights nobody expected. And that is the bravery of the soldiers that the whole world is watching, and we should be proud of that.
Yeah, but I'm not talking about the bravery of our soldiers, because there is no denying that fact. I am actually talking about the government's policy and what the government needs to do so that our soldiers all the time don't have to get into these situations where obviously they will do a brilliant job because they're trained like that and they have the courage to do that. But what about the government's end of the bargain?
Of course, the government will do, and you have seen that various ministers, even in earlier NDA regime, if you remember when Jaswant Singh was the minister, when George Fernandes was the defense minister, these issues were raised, but they were not taken up. in right earnestness, because you have to bring them to the table, you have to bring them to negotiating table, and you have to demarcate the boundary, because the flexible LAC of course leads to such flashpoints, and both sides must understand this, and we hope that after this disengagement that process will also start.
All right, I have one more point that I wanted to actually highlight earlier, and which is the conversation, which is the allegation that was made by the Congress party. The allegation was that we've given away finger 4. Dr. Ajay Kumar, basis what was that claim made by Rahul Gandhi? Because most experts would tell us that we actually only have our setup structures around finger 3.
No, the I think the issue is because of the incompleteness of the defense minister's statements. One is that if you're going to say that we're going to disengage and you can't, and so patrolling is off. And like General Dua correctly said, we don't know. Patrolling is obviously a flashpoint, so it will be off. But more important, Tanvi, is the question is, I like Sudesh here said that, if you listen to Mr. Rahul Gandhi's press conference also, he clearly has highlighted the role of the Air Force and the armed forces, and there's no debate on their commitment, and there's no point shooting from their shoulder. But the important part is the government must put with their mouth where the money is. Now look at if China is such a huge challenge, then what about this budget? You didn't give any increase to China in the defense budget at all. So it's nice to keep draping yourself in the national flag, which you did to host in Nagpur for 70 odd years. But the fact is that why did you increase the budget? Why did you increase the budget for the defense forces? Because the question is seriously, the defense forces budget, Sudeshi, and and irrespective of the hats we wear, is that if China is such a huge engagement, you need to raise another mountain division. The challenges for the defense forces are much more acute based on the strategic challenges we are facing. Couldn't we have found ways to increase the defense budget significantly for the next few years?
Yes.
And that's something worrying, and we've highlighted that right at the day of the budget.
So let's get a response from Sudesh Verma on that.
Tanvi, Ajay ji is a very learned person, and it would be good for Rahul Gandhi ji to take a lesson from him, because he doesn't understand the meetings of standing committees when defense people are going to brief them. He doesn't feel that he needs such kind of briefing. If you attend those meetings carefully, if you take some lessons in his strategic thinking, then you would not be raising such questions, because on foreign policy, on how to deal, there was never a problem at all. There was a consensus. For the first time, we see that consensus being broken. And of course, I agree to Ajay-ji. Whatever he's saying is sensible. But the same kind of sense, if you can bring down to your leader, that would help the country.
Can I?
Yes, Maroof.
I see. We can keep trying to sort of show which political party is doing the right thing at any given point of time. But, if history has taught me one thing, and I've done a lot of work over China over the last 10 months. Let me tell you that you need a vision and you need the courage, and that is where political courage would be required, to finally say that I am going to have the boundary come to some kind of a delineated level. The way we were able to get Pakistan to accept the line of actual control, and that was the setting stage for making it a full border. It is another story that Bhutto resigned despite the Suchetgarh Agreement of June 72. But here, the Chinese, and this is the point that China has to be now pushed into accepting that, Chinese diplomats and others keep making statements, let's put the boundary aside, let's move on in other ways. Sorry. We are not going to be able to engage with the Chinese anymore the way we used to, and that is open our damn doors for every Chinese company to enter the Indian market, simply because we thought the West was doing it, so should we. And China exploited those opportunities right across the world. They've made their pockets fat, and they're buying friends all over in our neighborhood. What we have to tell the Chinese, that any initiative with China will only move at least when you are willing to accept the maps of the 3 sectors. As General Dua would know, it is, the whole boundary with China is divided into Western sector, Central sector, Eastern sector. And the Chinese, except for the Central sector, where bulk of it really falls around Nepal, they are not willing to look at any of the other maps, and they play a hide and seek game with us with the maps. So I think one of the reasons for the success of the current state of initiatives, let's hope it has more successes to its credit, is because the MEA has finally allowed the military to be part of the discourse. Historically, we have been averse to having the military as part of the discourse. They are the guys who measure the ground with their feet. They can tell you every post, every turn, every bend, every corner. You can't leave all this to, people who can just wax eloquent, that they have never been to the front line. They don't know what the borders look like. Something which looks different on a satellite map looks very different on the ground.
Yes.
So you have to have a cohesive military diplomatic initiative. And I think the defense minister yesterday did refer to that. And that is the way forward. If you're going, don't expect the politicians to sit down with the map and then draw a line. McMahon did it. And that's what came out of the McMahon line, but the Chinese never fully accepted it. And in World War II, people, political leaders just drew a line somewhere, and he says, this is what will define the boundary of the East versus West of Europe. But now we have to have experts who do it. And there are enough experts in this country. There's a China study group that even gives details of places and points that have to be patrolled by military patrols, and that is then approved by MO and passed on to various units and formations. So it's done in a calibrated manner.
Okay.
But the fact of the matter is, you can't just leave it and go back to the Krishna Menon adage that, I'll talk the Chinese out of it at the UN. And we saw what happened in 1962. You can't talk the Chinese out of it. They're working to a plan. We have to work to a plan as a nation.
It is, may I make a point?
Yes, absolutely, General Dua.
On this point, I agree with Maroof, but the fact of the matter also is, whichever be the government in power, it is not for the want of trying. I'm talking of trying to resolve the LAC. There have been 22 meetings between the two sides to agree on the flashpoints, and 23 flashpoints have been agreed to. And like Maroof brought out, while during discussions, it has always been agreed that we will exchange maps and sit down and try and resolve it. But apart from the central sector, the Chinese are not really willing to exchange maps. They, on some pretext or the other, they will not present their side of the map at all, while our side has been forthcoming on that. So the fact of the matter is, while they are not doing it, is it to leave this open so that they can use this as a leverage in some other stage? So that is the big question, which things will change in a very defining manner after this development. And after this development, like Maroof said, we have to bring in the trade and diplomatic linkages to force China to come to a better understanding than having two LACs, your perception and my perception. Between this we can patrol, other places we will stay in post, etc. So what is going to be a turning point now from here onwards? LAC will certainly have more deployment than it has had last year, and in a pullback mode. And we will have to define our borders, call it LAC, two different perceptions, this, or call it whatever, but we'll have to define our borders in a better manner so that such flashpoints are not created. Thank you.
In fact, I'm going to take up that point and leave this entire conversation here. And I completely agree with what both of our experts say, that at the end of the day, there has to be a larger comprehensive policy in terms of how we tackle China and resolve these issues. And it cannot just be in isolation, just a military or just a trade, just a commerce or just a diplomatic kind of an approach that we have, but it has to be an overarching approach. When this conflict actually began last year, in the month of May and June, much before many others had even begun to talk about it or tell you what was going on, we here at Mirror Now reported to you what was going on and how it's going to take months at a stretch for us to even begin the process of pulling back. Things only intensified from there, but at least today we are at a point where we've actually seen on-ground disengagement take place. It's just step one in the positive direction, lots more to go. And then remember, de-escalation. Right now, we're only pulling back from facing each other like this. We then also have to look at the number of troops that have built up on both sides and reduce those numbers, reduce the tension. So we're going to keep a close track on this situation, hopefully with lesser politics on it. Thank you so much for joining us on this conversation.